Welcome back to Math 103. This is the third video on voting. Recall the following two preference tables for two different elections that we were looking at the end last time. We're asked, how do they differ in terms of plurality candidates and majority candidates? The purpose of this exercise is to make sure we've sorted out the difference between the two. In the first election, C has 10 first-choice votes, and that's more first-choice votes than any individual opponent. Therefore, C is the plurality candidate in the first election, and also in the second election, because C has, there too, more first-choice votes than any individual opponent. Okay, so much for plurality candidates. How about majority candidates? Well, to think about majority candidates, the first thing you always have to do is ask how many first-choice votes are required to be a majority candidate, and that is always the smallest whole number greater than half the total number of voters. Now, in each election, there are 21 voters total, and half of 21 equals 10.5, but of course, you can't actually receive 10.5 first-choice votes. You could, however, receive 11 or more, and 11 is the smallest number of first-choice votes needed to be a majority. Great! Now we can figure out whether we have majority candidates in our elections. In election number 1, we simply do not. In election number 1, there is no candidate with 11 votes or more, 11 first-choice votes or more, but in election number 2, C does indeed have 11 first-choice votes. Therefore, in election number 1, it simply happens that there is no majority candidate, and that is okay. In election number 2, C is the majority candidate. Now we turn to a new notion, that of fairness in election results. So let's look again at these same two elections, election number 1 and election number 2. Election number 1 had no majority candidate. Election number 2 did have a majority candidate. Both of them have plurality candidates. So according to your intuition, again, speaking solely in terms of your intuition, if we apply a voting method other than the plurality method to election number 1, and somehow the inner workings of this voting method, the way it computes with the data given, results in C losing, is that result unfair? If we use the plurality method, C would have won. If we use some other method, then somebody else might win. Is that unfair? The follow-up question is about election number 2. If we apply a voting method to election number 2 and C loses, is the result unfair? Now, these are questions for your intuition. There is a certain case to be made that we can live with C losing the first election much more easily than we can live with C losing the second election. In the first election, well, there were 3 candidates, nobody had a majority. Yes, C had a plurality, but, you know, the fact is that although there are 10 people who really like C, there are 11 voters total, who despise C. So maybe C is not such a good representative of the will of the people in election number 1. But in election number 2, an outright majority of voters, more than half the voters, have C as their first choice. So there is perhaps a certain intuition. If you had that intuition, then you're in good company. There's a certain intuition that C really ought to win this election, and something has gone wrong if anyone other than C wins election number 2. That's just one intuition, however. We come to a very important idea in this chapter, that of a fairness criterion. We've been talking intuitively about fairness. Now we're going to get precise. A fairness criterion is a precise statement which expresses a specific intuition about what should or should not occur in a fair election. Now, there's a caution here, and this is a common confusion among students. There is a difference between a voting method and a fairness criterion. In a specific election, when you apply a voting method, it computes who does in fact win. It crunches the information and tells us, behold, so-and-so is the winner. By contrast, a fairness criterion, in regard to a particular election, a fairness criterion either tells us who should win that particular election, or maybe it doesn't even apply. Maybe it has nothing to say about that particular election. Great, so we're ready for fairness criterion number 1. We will have 4 fairness criteria, 4 precise statements that we make, each one expressing a different intuition about what should or should not occur. Here's number 1, the majority criterion. If there is a majority candidate in an election, then that candidate should be the winner. That means if an election is held, and if there is a majority candidate, which there might not be, okay, but if there happens to be a majority candidate, and somehow that majority candidate doesn't win, that's bad news. Then we say that the election result violates the majority criterion. So I really need to give a caution here because this is a common confusion. Right? The logic now gets a little more challenging. Sometimes there is no majority candidate. And if there happens not to be a majority candidate in an election, then the majority criterion has nothing to say about who should or should not win. So no matter which candidate wins an election where there was no majority candidate in the first place, there's no violation of the majority criterion. Right? So advocates of the majority criterion, people who have that viewpoint on what counts as fair or unfair, could only possibly get angry if there was a majority candidate in the first place and that candidate lost. So let's recall now our contrasting pair of preference tables, election number 1 and election number 2. Okay. Remember that election number 1 gave us a plurality candidate, namely C, but no majority candidate. By contrast, election number 2 did have a majority candidate. Great. So our question now is, if election number 1, in election number 1, if a voting method is used, and it crunches the data and it declares A the winner, has the majority criterion been violated? And in election number 2, if a voting method is used and it declares A the winner, has the majority criterion been violated over here? In the first election, there is no majority candidate. And since there is no majority candidate, the majority criterion has nothing to say about who should or should not win this election. In other words, there is no violation here of the majority criterion. By contrast, in election number 2, there is a majority candidate, namely C, but A wins the election anyway. That was the premise of the question, that a voting method is applied which somehow, by its inner workings, declares A to be the winner of this election. Well, in that case, the election result does violate the majority criterion. There was a right candidate and a wrong candidate, and the wrong candidate won. Let's look at this another way. In any election, there are 3 possibilities. One is that there is a majority candidate who also wins the election. Great. Very good news from the point of view of the majority criterion. There's a right candidate, and the right candidate wins. Another possibility, possibility number 2, is that there's a majority candidate who is not the winner. So there is a majority candidate, but somehow that candidate doesn't win. This can actually happen. And we'll see elections in which, we'll see voting methods and elections in which this happens. And when it does happen, it is very bad news from the point of view of the majority criterion, because there was a right candidate, there was a majority candidate, all the rest of the candidates are therefore the wrong candidate, and in spite of this, a wrong candidate won. A third possibility is that there's no majority candidate at all. That happens, such as in Minnesota in 1998. In this case, the majority criterion has nothing to say. There is no right candidate. Okay? So the important idea is that only Item number 2 on this list counts as violating the majority criterion. Only item number 2 on this list counts as violating the one precise definition of fairness that we've written so far. Before going on to the next video, answer the questions below about our very first example, involving 50 voters and 3 candidates, Pat, Sam, and Alex. How many first-choice votes are needed to be a majority candidate in this election? And if we apply a certain voting method, and Alex is declared the winner, does this election result violate the majority criterion?